What's good, everyone? My name is Jacob Moses, and welcome to another episode of the Not Boring Tech Writer, where in each episode we focus on a different skill that you can learn to enhance your skill set, improve your marketability, diversify your career, and ultimately break the stereotype that technical writing is a boring career. This episode's skill: getting started in open data. For the civically-minded technical writer, there's a growing movement in cities across the globe where technical writers can use their skills to better their community. It's called Open Data Day, an annual celebration of open data groups around the world, partnering with local governments to use open data to achieve a shared goal in the community. From analyzing environmental data to tracking public money flows, open data gives citizens, from data folk to everyday advocates, an opportunity to get the data they need to take action in their communities. As a technical writer, you may not initially see how your skills fit into Open Data Day. However, as you'll learn in this episode, successful Open Data Days need compelling narratives to complement outcomes and tutorials to teach people how to actually use the data that they want to access, and much more, all areas in which the tech writer succeeds. That's why in this episode I have Jesse Hamner and two-time guest Kyle Taylor on the podcast, longtime open data advocates who've seen firsthand the value of the tech writer. In this episode, Jesse and Kyle help us understand the value of open data and how the civically-minded technical writer can get plugged into this exciting movement. Before we get started, big shout out to Knowledge Owl, the wonderful knowledge-based software, for sponsoring the Not Boring Tech Writer, and I hope you all enjoy this episode. Kyle, Jesse, what's going on, fellas? How are you today?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. I think we're all simultaneously in Denton, Texas, but not with each other, not in person. The two of you are,
That's right.
Yep.
but I'm solo.
The magic of the internet. That's how.
Yes, it's fantastic. I'm in what they call a sunroom in my apartment, and it kind of acts like a sunroom, like it's pretty sunny, but it doesn't
Yeah.
look like the ones I see on the internet.
Yeah.
So a little underwhelming, but still a good setting for a podcast.
You know what? We're out here on Jesse's back porch by the
Oh,
pool, and
you got
yeah,
all the sun.
we're also
Yeah.
enjoying the sun.
Yep.
You don't need a sunroom. You got the actual sun on the porch. I love it. Well, Kyle and Jesse, so excited to have you guys on the podcast today. We have a great skill to discuss together. Perhaps for the civically minded tech writer, or the tech writer who cares about the collective good of their community or their neighborhood, whatever. And that is getting started with open data. And push back on me if I get this explanation or definition incorrect about what open data is. But from the brief Google search I did before this, it sounds like just encouraging governments, businesses, and civil society just to adopt open data policies. So say they're working on a particular project or whatever it might be to meet their vision or goal. Let's open that up as needed to get other people involved to help kind of what I imagine is most of the time it's just with government, perhaps a shared goal within the community. Is that a fair definition?
It is, and there's additional pieces of that that I think are important. The first is you don't always know the uses to which the data might be put, and so opening it up enables creative involvement by people or novel solutions to certain problems. That's one angle. The second is sharing the data for municipalities and for governments is something we're also pushing as a civic requirement since it's taxpayer funded. And so unless there's a
Yeah,
reason for personally identifiable information or something else like that, you ought to share it because, well, we should be able to see that.
sure, sure. Totally makes sense. Well, and Kyle, Jesse, I know you guys have been in this game for a bit. Kyle, of course, as the founder of TechMill, doing excellent work advocating not only for open data, but a variety of tech-driven things to better the city of Denton. And Jesse, I know you've been a huge advocate as well, working with TechMill. So Overjoyed to have you guys on the podcast. It's going to be a lot of fun. Um, Jesse, you helped kind of give us or round out the definition of what open data is. I want to learn a little bit more about the two of you and y'all's involvement in open data, not only in Denton, but just kind of your overall philosophy about how you approach it. Can you guys tell us a little bit about yourselves and what got you involved in open data?
Yeah, so I can start. So my entire professional career has been focused in web development and uh, on the side doing a lot of like startup support, like working with startups and working in the tech community and really focusing my work on education for the most part, which is kind of where TechMill was born from, where we just wanted to enable our local tech community. And so whether we were doing workshops teaching people how to code, or we were working with the local city on like government funded co-working spaces or something like that, everything always kind of for me came back to, how can we use data to like make ourselves a little more established, or how can we use it for good?
Sure.
And so, one of our most favorite former city councilmen here in Denton is a guy named Kevin Roden, who I'm sure we are all familiar with in some
Shout out
capacity.
Kevin Roden.
That's right.
Shout out Kevin Roden.
And he used to run these annual creative mixers. And what his goal was to let's bring together the best, brightest people in our city, and let's listen to what they have to say. Let's listen to their ideas and see if it's something that other people might be interested in and contribute to. So I was really interested in starting an open data portal or program, or just community in that aspect, where I wanted to find other people in the city who wanted to use open data and just build cool stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how can we build it for the better? And so I went to a big idea mixer. I stood up on stage, said I wanted to start something called Open Denton, and then got off stage. Ended up talking to Daniel Bossolo, who was a lawyer and another co-founder of TechMill prior to TechMill. He was like, "Hey, I'm a lawyer. You might not want to release a lot of that data, but let's talk about what you could do." And so just from that point, a few of us had got together. We had a little hackathon at Kevin's house one time whenever we were talking about, hey, we just had some district lines redrawn. How can we help citizens understand like what their new district is, just where they can go to a
Fantastic.
website, put in their address, and like, hey, listen, here's the people in your district that you can vote for. And that was just like a beginning of this whole open data movement, at least that I've seen in the city of Denton. It's just starting 4 or 5 years ago.
And this is an annual event, correct? Like there's open data days happening every year all across the world. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
yeah, that's right. So Open Data Day
Fantastic.
it's an international event, and so we just anyone can put on their own event, and so we've been pretty lucky to have a group of passionate people who want to join us every year to put this event on. So yeah, it's the day of the year where we can all get together, pull together some city projects, whether it's from our own city or cities around us. See how we can use the open data provided in those city portals, and then build something that is going to end up benefiting all the citizens in the end.
Nice.
Yeah.
Jesse, what about you? What got you involved in the open data game?
I used to work at the UNT libraries. I was the
Nice.
director of research, and for me, we saw two things were happening. Number one, open access publications were becoming a thing, in part because people are frustrated at the rising cost of academic journals, and they're
Mm-hmm.
rising at like 3 times the rate of inflation or something. So
Wow.
yeah, it's kind of spooky.
Yeah.
And then the second is there's an open access portal that's been around for a very long time for physics publications called Archive, ARXIV, and they found that they were able to roughly speed up the pace of innovation, results, collaboration by about 1 year over
Mm.
the publication of a new article that had the data. Say, look, I'm going to
Wow.
get this thing published in Science or Nature or whatever. Here's the data now. So that gives people a chance to work with it, kick it, and go to town with it and learn from it a year. So it really radically speeds up
Oh, that's huge.
innovation.
Yeah.
And the obvious follow on is, people would occasionally say, do you have records from the city council in 1958 or whatever? It's like, yeah, we have scans of that or whatever. And so it's terrible. And then there's no real way except to manually enter the data. I had to do some big projects for some, for some mass atrocities data, which is not real fun, but we had to, get it typed up by a couple of different people, 25,000 entries, had to
Mm,
check it. That's awful, right? Those data should
sure.
be available without having to go through the analog hole. And so he said, well, let's teach people about data. And then you realize that people don't really know what to do with data a lot. They don't know,
Mm,
what does a code book mean, or how do I understand what's in these data, what they tell me, what they could tell me, how do I analyze them? And a lot of those things kind of became the impetus for, hey, let's have days where we bring people together who might be interested, who have different skill sets, teach people how to use data and actually use the data. So that's kind of how I got involved about 5-6 years ago.
got it. That totally makes sense. And Jesse and Kyle, as you guys are explaining what open data is, sharing your own involvement, I imagine many of our listeners who are familiar with, open source projects, familiar with GitHub, probably nodding along, like they understand what you're explaining, but maybe they get kind of caught up or maybe unfamiliar with this municipal data tilt to it. What is really the difference between a lot of the type of projects that tech writers, documentarians are working on in GitHub compared to what's happening with these open data projects? Are they similar? Are they different? Are these drastic differences? What's happening there?
I think one of the best things, one of the ideas that Kyle had was to provide sort of a glue layer between the municipal data that we were able to get put on the open data site and what do these mean? What formats are they stored in? What problems do they have? Because you may get perfectly reasonable data in a format you can't use because you don't know what the variable names are or what they mean. You don't know how they code certain variables. Is a 1 through 5, is that a Likert scale? It's, I strongly agree, or is it an actual integer value? You don't know. And so those things matter a lot when you're trying to use the data. So we created GitHub instances for many different data sets. And here's an issue. This one doesn't have a code book. This one doesn't do that. This one doesn't do that.
Gotcha.
And so generally the data quality is probably okay. The data usability is nearly zero,
Mm.
and it's getting better as people get better at this in the municipal world, but you're still going to get a lot of data that has no real tie to what you want to use it for.
Yeah, and so I think even at just like a low level lift, what we did one year was, prior to going to an open data day event, we were like, you know what, we have all this great data, but no one's going to know what it means. So
Mm.
we need to spend some time cleaning it up, right? And so we just got a group of people on a Saturday afternoon, ordered some pizza, and said, hey, listen, let's just make a couple of repos, get on GitHub that point to these large data sets where in the data set there could be a number of individual data profiles or whatever it might be, and let's start identifying those issues, and then anyone could log in and just file an issue saying, hey, this code book is incorrect, hey, we have 4 of the 10 and these other 6 need to be identified, things like that.
Gotcha.
It was really just like a way for them to like mark up
Sure.
here are the
Sure.
changes that need to be made, and then at what we had at the end honestly was a list of issues that had solutions to them for the most part, and we could
Nice.
give those right back to the city and say, hey, here's where your data is falling apart, or here's where we need
Mm.
more clarification. And honestly, in the end, everyone wins because the city gets to clean up their data, and then we actually get to use it in a way that makes sense.
So I'm curious, Kyle and Jesse, like, why does any of this matter? Like, maybe the tech writer that's worked a lot in GitHub, they're focusing more on, maybe creating a new product or service. Yeah, they still have that collaboration, but it's not so much related to their community or perhaps, the financial resiliency of where they live. Thinking more of like a global product or service, more so than, something that actually help their neighborhood. For that tech writer listening to this that, kind of has that inclination to look at their neighborhood, they care about the well-being of their community and their peers. Like, where does open data fit in this entire process?
So there's 2 or 3 things I think are valuable for 2 or 3 different ways. These are valuable opportunities. The first is maybe you just are a do-gooder, right? And you want to get involved and help people, with the data-driven problems, questions they have.
Hmm.
So One year, one of the local charities came and said, "Hey, where should we put the mobile food pantry?" Like, what a great question.
Hmm.
Where's the areas of greatest need that'll be the most responsive? So maybe you just want to get involved and help people do that. Maybe you want to provide objective sources of data so that policy decisions can be made with the backing of some data as opposed to just
Yeah.
political preference. And the third is, and this is something that I didn't realize till I got a job where we used a lot of repositories that are private, and that is nobody knows what you're doing or if you're good at stuff. But if
Hmm.
you've got a public facing repository and public involvement with this data project, or you've written the documentation for or gotten involved in and used, that's kind of like a digital portfolio. It's kind
Yeah.
of a digital resume these days. And I didn't realize, but when I applied for my most recent job, they said, "Yeah, your GitHub repo looks pretty good." They went and checked it out. And so there's several reasons to get involved, and even some of them are self-serving.
Yeah. I love it. Have you all found that it's common for municipalities to actually find opportunities to use data, have their data maybe dictate future interventions, or is most of this often, kind of locked up in a vacuum? It doesn't necessarily, guide future strategies.
Uh, I think it depends on the maturity of an open data policy for the city, right?
Gotcha.
Because
Oh, so it's a policy first
yeah,
that a municipality has to adopt
that's
before an open data day can happen, or
that's
at least
right.
to get them involved. Gotcha.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
beyond just a FOIA.
even in Denton, right? So like 5-6 years ago, like we didn't even have that great of an open data policy at the time, where
Gotcha.
even if you wanted to request data, like you could go up to City Hall, whatever it might be, request a data set, then they're going to charge you $5 and put it on a disk, and you'll get it within 3 to 5 days in the mail, right?
Mm,
And what's on that disk could be a number of PDFs, but it's in a format that is not easily usable in a way that you can apply to
gosh.
like software.
Yeah, so you can still get that data, but not nearly as helpful if
Yeah,
someone actually adopted a open data policy.
exactly. I mean, the
Gotcha.
sleepless nights Jesse and I have had converting PDFs to
Yeah.
Oh, I
JSON
don't doubt
files.
it.
Yeah, I
I
really learned
don't
an
doubt
awful lot
it.
about the inner workings of PDF, and it's not something you should want to do.
Yeah. So I mean, and once a city, starts to make that progress where they have decided that, this is a policy change that we want to make, we want to open up this data for our citizens. I think a lot of the cities are kind of hesitant at first because they
Sure.
think that the data could be used against them.
Totally.
But honestly, it's usually used in a constructive way. I mean, we had an event, I think it was last year, where just it was like a 12-year-old, and who was it? It was Habib's son and someone else working on financial data from the
Yeah.
city of Denton, and they were like, "Hey, you guys are spending more money than you're making," and they just like put some
This
data
is
in.
an issue.
Yeah, it was just in like Tableau, right? It was like a free version of like Tableau or something.
Gosh.
But it's things like that, and then you have this report, and you can, if you wanted to, show up to city council, say, "Hey, look, we found this thing in this data. We think we
Sure.
should look at it."
Sure.
I think that's where, well, while a lot of people could be scared of that, that's where a lot of the power comes from, and that's where positive change comes from.
Yeah.
And the need to transmit that information, those findings, is also like the people who are hearing it have to trust that you've used the data correctly, you've gotten the correct data. The
Mm,
first response for somebody who didn't want to see that would say, "You're a 12-year-old, what can you possibly do?" Right? Well,
sure.
if
Sure.
you've got everything locked down and say, "Well, here's where the data came from, here's how we analyze the data, here's how we put stuff together," then you get to knock that out as a problem. Whether you're 12 or 110, like,
Sure.
it's something you can just say, "Nope, that, there's no more assertion that I'm correct. It's prove me wrong. Are
Yep.
these
That's right.
data yours or not yours?"
Yep.
Love it. I'm curious. So the city say they adopt this open data policy. We have great advocates like Kyle or Jesse on the ground to actually put together one of these annual open data days. From y'all's experience, I know you've knocked out a fair bit of these at this point. Who shows up? I imagine it's going to be very surprising for listeners that it's really not only programmers, correct, or just the data geeks. Do you get a good mix of attendees?
It's a full spectrum
That's awesome.
Yeah,
as
it
far as
really
I'm
is.
concerned. I mean, yeah, I would say largely it's going to be a lot of tech people, and it's mostly tech people who might not even be as passionate about open data as some of the rest of us, but they often just find it as an opportunity to improve their skill set or try something
Mm-hmm.
new or just kind of get more involved in the community. Then you
Nice.
have a subset of people who are just really passionate about open data and like wanting to make that policy change. And then you even have a group of people who are passionate about like the policy, but they may not have any kind of technical aptitude from like a software development standpoint.
Mm.
But in the end, like everyone is just as equally valuable, right? It's like it doesn't matter if you can write Python or JavaScript. It doesn't matter if you can like do documentation. One year we actually had a group of people who made YouTube videos for how to use the open data portal because no
Awesome.
one knew how to use it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just like a very low barrier, but very impactful because if no one knows how to use it, how are we even
Sure.
going to make use of it? What's the point of the policy? So yeah, at that point, it's a full spectrum of people, and honestly, everyone's invited as far as we're concerned.
Yeah,
That's
the
awesome.
people who've shown up have really been able to work together in ways that are always good and sometimes surprising, right? We had a bunch of Pythonistas come out and really make a difference for the United Way of Denton County 2 years ago, and saved them on the order of about 30 hours a month of work. With
Wow.
by the end of the day, they had this thing that worked, and the documentation was, again, with YouTube, was, I didn't see that coming. And although I should have known that my friends who were librarians who came, they would say, you know, people need to be able to use this.
Sure.
And it makes things very democratic, useful, because if you only have a bunch of data nerds who know how to use it, that's just another barrier, and it creates another problem of, yeah, but why should we believe you? We can't use it. And so
Sure.
it avoids other, like, social fabric problems that come from, why should I believe all the nerds?
Sure.
And one other group that I've been consistently pleased shows up is, the tech community in Denton's pretty strong, and it's sort of nebulous and sort of hard to specify or engage with. And so, because so many folks show up, you get local politicos, local politicians showing up to say, hey,
Good.
I want to be involved with you and your community. I want to represent your community. Some of them bring sponsorships, just, I'll buy some coffee for the day or whatever. And
Yeah.
that's also powerful, because they see the value of, it's not just Habitat for Humanity building houses, it's a bunch of nerds
Sure.
building data sets too. That's also charitable good works. So I think that's been powerful, as well as just the broad spectrum of attendees who work.
And then thinking about where the tech writer fits in this, I mean, you guys presented this so well. We have the data folk who really understand how to look and, maybe present the data, make it readable. And I imagine the tech writer comes in. Kyle, you gave the example of these video tutorials. I know, thinking back on my own career, different tech writers that I've conversed with, they really pride themselves on packaging very compelling documents.
Mm-hmm.
So say we had the data folk, they got this data, tech writer can take it, put together this really compelling package, and then let's bring in the local politico, the local advocate, who can use their own anecdotes, language, persuasive arguments to really say, hey, this is data we should pay attention to, and that we should use to guide any future efforts. Did I miss anything about where the tech writer fits in this? You mentioned the video tutorials. Any other examples of where a tech writer can thrive in this environment?
Yeah, I think there are a number that come off the top of my head, which I think one would be, as part of these events, we may be doing something to produce a new data set or like an analysis. So writing up summaries of that analysis is definitely useful.
Gotcha.
In addition to, maybe during the event, we may not be reporting or like, generating a report, but we may be developing a tool to, run something on that data set in the future, right? So we have identified an issue with the data set. We have identified like a translation that we need to make with it. And now we need to write a piece of software to then do that transformation and get an output that is now usable. So, tech writers can help us write that documentation for how to use the software correctly.
Nice.
Because that's like, I mean, we've all seen the number of GitHub repos that have just either no readmes or really bad readmes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So like, what's the good in software if you don't know how to use it? So
Sure.
And learning how to work with people who, GitHub's a pretty good lingua franca for code repositories and for code transmission. And so there's a lot of value there in learning how the flow works. If you haven't done that before, I'm hopeful that it will become less of a barrier to participation as just the years roll on. More people have seen GitHub. And then I would also say that as we're focused on solving problems and providing proofs of concept for solutions, documentation so often takes a backseat to actually does it work? And that's a shame because you can't always show how cool your outputs are.
Sure.
It really helps with just the advocacy and the marketing, frankly, to have good, competent technical writing to say, here's how this works, here's how this can work going forward, here's how it's generally workable, here's specifications we need for the next iteration. That stuff's important, and it always gets short shrift.
Oh, that's an interesting point, Jesse. So it kind of sounds like the tech writer can help, create a model of what, an effective open data project looks like.
Yeah.
At least for open data, it's an annual event. Ideally, this is the conversation we're having throughout the year as well, and maybe brainstorming projects ahead of time. But it sounds like the tech writer can do a good job of maybe not so much a template, but what do we want the actual outcome to look like when it comes to this presentation?
Totally.
That's awesome.
Yeah, they're really, I mean, we laugh about sort of, it's not just for nerds, but no, you've really got to have a whole team to make this work because the city council typically are not anywhere even programming adjacent typically. And
Sure.
so you need good marketing and you need to be able to bring stuff to them that helps make the point of what we're up to, why it matters, why they should listen.
So. Love it. Love it. I want to talk a little bit about the types of projects that you guys have done for past open data days. I know, Jesse, you just mentioned, we're often in the business of problem solving and getting a proof of concept. How much does this open data process of actually, brainstorming and creating a project align with maybe, similar problems that tech writers have been told to document with maybe their 9-to-5 employer? How are those processes similar, and how do you think they differ?
I think that as being able to specify a problem carefully and clearly is the absolute driver of what makes for a successful open data day project. Even getting involved 2 weeks beforehand to say, here's what I'm going to need on that day. Because you've got, frankly, 8 hours of work maybe, and people get tired in the afternoon. And the first half of the day is pretty much spent organizing, communicating tasks, figuring out what all you need in terms of resources that are like computational in nature. Do I need an Amazon web server? Do I need this? Do I need an EC2 instance? So to be able to set up a decent project plan, which is something that a lot of people know how to do, but won't do in advance of Open Data Day. And we don't typically throw that back on the cities who request help because that seems that we know they're already understaffed and they're coming to us and saying, hey, we'd like this answer, but they won't say, and here's 40 hours of work on the project plan. So getting it involved a month in advance, 2 months in advance, brainstorming ideas, looking at the data and saying, well, these data suck, but they sure could be better. And we sure could answer some cool questions if they ...
Sure.
That sort of thing is the absolute driver for success in Open Data Day.
Yeah. And I even adding on to that, I mean, when we first started running Open Data Day events, I think we were probably too optimistic, or we were just really excited about the idea of we can start gathering
naive.
data.
The word you're looking for is naive.
That's probably the right word. Yeah. And what we weren't looking at initially were the outcomes, right? Like we were just looking at the inputs. We're like, look at all the inputs we have. Look at all the data sets we have to work with. But we weren't really as focused on, well, that's great, but what do we want to get out of it, right? And so
give us an example, Kyle, of a moment where someone may, hyper focus on inputs as opposed to actually thinking about the outcome that they want to achieve.
I have one right on the tip of my tongue, which was, I think it was our second Open Data Day annual event. And we had just received, I think it was that morning or something, we had just received a data set that consisted of civic code violation data for like the past 5 years or something like that. We're like, this is great. This is fresh new data. We can do so much with it. And so there was like me and Dan, one of our other techno members, and then another member who was in our group. We're like, we need to just start cleaning this data. We need to there's so much stuff we can do with it. And
but what do we do with it? What does this mean?
parallel in how to process the data, but we weren't actually focusing on what was the report we were
Makes
going to run.
sense. And what's the action items?
Yeah,
Yeah.
what were we going to do with it? Now, the next year we did actually produce something, but that first year we were just so excited that we had a new piece of data that we just honestly didn't get, get a lot
And
out of
that
it.
that
Sure.
next year they swung the other direction, and we overstacked their team so much they had the entire website stood up by 10 a.m. and it was it was working, and then they spent the rest of the day doing polishing and making it really sweet. But it
Yeah.
was sort of funny because the rest of us were sitting around going, all right, how are we going to bring in the GIS data for this, and this? So we're stuck back where they were the year before, and they're sitting around twiddling their thumbs saying, website works great. What do you got for me?
Yeah.
And so, we could have coordinated better on that, but it was a great story to tell the politicos who were there, because it was like, our team is so good. They've already got results and we're still drinking the second cup of coffee,
I
So,
love it. I love
but
it.
yeah, that's that we do. And I certainly do, because I appreciate, I spend a lot of time with data. I appreciate just clean code books and stuff. And I'll spend a lot of time making sure it's usable and not actually using it. So I got to be careful with that myself, but also it's easier to spot that behavior when it happens because I know it.
Yeah. Give us a few examples of some success stories that came from Open Data Day. I know you guys got really excited about this new data set in regards to code violations, but give me something where, there was a finished package they could look back and say, like, damn, like in 24 hours, we put together something pretty compelling that got everyone involved, the tech writer, the designer, the data folk. What are some stories that come to mind?
I'm going to tell a real quick one, and then I want Kyle to tell the story about the potholes and the seams in the concrete. Remember the guys from Louisville?
Oh, I think you know that story better than I do.
Okay. All right. Well, then I'll tell the one. The city of Louisville brought in a bunch of, like, many gigabytes of camera images that had been taken with downward facing cameras mounted onto vehicles, right? So they're taking pictures of the road as they're driving over the road, right? And what they said was, hey, we have all these pictures. I don't know why they had them in the first place, but they said, we'd like to be able to make some estimation of road quality. And by the end of the day, a team working had built a model that they had a pretty good teaching data set. So they did some artificial intelligence, some machine learning, and said, we can 98% of the time distinguish potholes from manhole covers, and we can distinguish seams in the road from cracks in the road.
Wow.
And so by the end of the day, they had a pretty good way to say, okay, here's a proof of concept, Louisville. You can now use those data and this model to tell yourself something about the quality of the road without anybody else doing anything. So that is, and then of course the problem was that they didn't document the AI software, but they did provide it to them wholesale. So it was like, here's the software, but it wasn't, here's how you use the software, here's how you teach people about it. So less documentation there, but that was a big win, I think. And I mentioned the United Way of Denton County. That was a big win that required a lot of instruction, because the people who were going to use the outputs were not technical people. They were working at the United Way as interns and whatnot. And so that really did require some long-term collaboration with the people who were managing the resources from the United Way, and also the Python team that showed up. So that was a very big success story. And again, saving 30 hours a month of work, that's
big
non-trivial.
time.
And
That's
it really
big
was
time.
easy to automate compared to the danger of mistakes that are just from human having to go through data. So those are two big ones. There's other ones I think that are valuable, but those are the kinds of things people will bring. And I didn't know what the city of Louisville was going to bring. And by the end of the day, they had, we had really sort of pulled a rabbit out of the hat. And I wasn't involved, the overall team, but we do get inputs from months in advance. People say, hey, please please help us with. So I don't want to pretend like you can just show up and have it poof magic. But that's those are some pretty good examples, I think. What else we got, Kyle?
Yeah, I mean, the last one that comes to mind that I think is, I think it was more of a wow story than anything else. But we had a hackathon prior to Open Data Day last year, where we had he was like a visiting professor at North Texas Information Science, and
Professor Wong.
we had 30 days worth of Waze traffic data for
Oh,
North Texas. And so what
For
that
the
data
whole metro
for the
area.
whole
wow.
metroplex, and what that consists of is things like incident events and the severity of an incident, what type of incident,
Okay.
car wrecks, car stopping road, is it a major, super major, low, minor kind of relation. And what this guy did is that he was looking at the correlation of events to when an accident actually happened and trying to predict when an accident could happen based on that data. And so at the first event that we had before Open Data Day, he had spent the whole day basically building a model where at the end of the day, he was able to, you could feed in Waze data and predict with up to 76% accuracy, I think, of when a traffic accident is going to happen. So if that
Gosh.
model is that accurate, you could use that with Department of Safety
Yeah.
or local police, and start to feed safety officers in that
Yeah.
area prior to an event
So you can
happening.
interrupt the
That's
process
amazing.
before it gets going. Yep.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Then when we get to Open Data Day, his presentation, he was like, "So we built this a few months ago, but we had a problem. We didn't contribute weather as an issue."
Oh, and we know
Turns
those snowy or rainy days in North Texas, that completely changes how we drive.
That's right. So what he did was he improved the model to include weather as an input. But still, like while there wasn't a totally complete program used at the end, there was a model built that can start being collaborated on to improve, that could actually be something that could be used by any of those departments up here. So
And it
That's
wasn't it
amazing.
wasn't a
How
finished product, right? We had the static data. There was no live streaming problem. There was no what's the actual weather right now. You've got to go hit the National Weather Service API. Like, none of that.
mm.
But did it work? Yeah, it
yeah,
worked
it
really
was very
well.
impressive.
And this came from, one guy locally with an idea who's willing to show up at this event, share his vision, get some other inputs, other ideas from folk. What
Yep.
sounds like a nearly finished product that, if someone were to adopt it, could really do some good for our
Worth
community.
worth noting that that day he didn't know PostgreSQL or PostGIS, and some of the ways you can ways bad pun some of the methods you can use with GIS software, open source GIS software, to engage with these data from Waze. Similarly, I think a couple of years ago, wasn't I helping you with some Python problems that you were
Yeah,
having?
yeah,
Yeah.
I
So
didn't even know Python then.
yeah, and so like we
Mm,
end up doing tutorials ad hoc, but also Kyle's a really good coder, and yet I was teaching him some stuff he didn't know just on that day, because we were like, well, we're going to use Python. So
yeah,
it's not like you've got to be experienced and great at everything. It's like,
sure.
show up. If you can learn coding, then learn coding. Let's go. So,
Yep. It really speaks just the value of collaboration. I know, of course, we have tons of societal systemic problems that really at scale are super intimidating. I know we're coming up on an election where everyone's really throwing out big ideas. And when we get on the neighborhood level, we don't really know how those big ideas and big plans are actually going to work, if it's actually going to make our communities better. But when we start, like you guys have done with open data, like, hey, you're a citizen of this community, you observe a problem, present to this group, let's share crazy ideas, let's figure this out together, test it right away, pivot. I imagine if we had more communities adopting what you guys are doing here in Denton, we'd be much better off. So really admire the work you guys are doing. I'm curious, for tech writers who are intrigued by what you guys have discussed today, anywhere online where they can go take a look and actually see what Open Data Day is all about, and maybe some projects that you guys have done in the past.
So there is a website for the actual event from opendataday.org. That's got the by-country events that are happening this year, and it's got a little of the philosophical sort of underpinnings.
Nice.
Then we've got opendenton.com, which
Mm-hmm.
is the local one. We don't do a lot of showing off of previous projects there. We aren't really good at that. We just sort of turn them loose. But then there's also some of the GitHub repositories that are linked from there. And so
Nice.
there's some ways to look at the previous work, or at least the previous focus of effort. And what else? I would say there are open data portals from various municipalities you can go and look at, both to get ideas and to see the state of how people are sharing data as a municipality. So you can say, oh, this one's really good, or oh, this one's just a series of downloads, or oh, this one's actually an interactive port. Like there's a bunch of variation
Gotcha.
there. So I'd say those 3 things would be a useful place to start.
Yep, agreed.
And then we have an Open Data Day event coming up, correct?
That's
March
right.
7th.
March 7th.
March 7th. This is happening at different communities all across the world, correct? We
Yeah.
have one here in Denton. Other ones in North America, I'd imagine?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, there's a number in North America. Actually, I think are we the only other one in Texas?
There's one in Austin.
There's
Has
one
been
in
for many
Austin.
years now.
Right.
So
Yeah.
Austin, and then last year there were 2 in DFW, because I think UT Arlington did one, and
That's
then
right.
we did one.
Yeah.
And they may not have registered it on the website this year, but they may be redoing it. I don't really know.
Yeah.
So, but there's a bunch of nationwide, predictably,
It's gonna be like
Silicon
your Boston,
Valley,
Chicago.
Boston,
A lot of
Gotcha.
those kind of really involve civic communities, at least. So
think of it as the same sort of thing as Code for America, right? You've got Silicon Valley folks, you've got big city
Mhm.
folks, and then you're going to have the odd small communities like us that has a good sort of, well, we're heterogeneous, but we bring a bunch of cool varieties.
Sure.
So
Sure.
we'll buy the coffee if you guys show up.
yeah,
I love it. Well, you all have done fantastic work. I got a love for both of you and the ways you guys have advocated for, bringing more of a tech data driven approach to not only the ways we, create policy, but, the way that we run our cities. So I'm very proud of each of you. Thank you guys for sharing your message today. If anybody wants to connect with the 2 of you personally, see what's going down with Kyle and Jesse, where can folk connect with y'all online?
You can find me at Kyle Tailored on pretty much anything. Twitter.
That's Kyle Taylor
ED. That's right. Kyle Taylor
Gotcha.
ED. And I'm pretty much all across the board there.
Perfect.
Yeah, I'm fairly present on Twitter at J Hamner. That's HAMNER, and I'm around on GitHub a pretty good bit too. I'm
GitHub is a
Jesse
good
Hamner
place.
on GitHub, so yeah, that's easy to spot.
Find us on GitHub.
Yeah, find us on
Perfect.
GitHub. Not wrong. Yeah.
That sounds good. Well, listeners, in the show notes below the player, we'll include links to Jesse's and Taylor's different social profiles, including their GitHubs, then links to all this great open data stuff that they have shared with us today. And if GitHub open source, if that's new for y'all, Kyle and I actually have a past episode of the Not Boring Tech Writer where he gives a really nice intro into getting involved in open source projects. And I will include a link to that as well. Jesse, Kyle, thank y'all. This has been a lot of fun. We'll talk soon.
Thanks, Jacob.
Thanks,
We'll talk to you
man.
later.
Thanks, fellas. Thanks again to Knowledge Owl, creators of the wonderful knowledge-based software, for sponsoring the Not Boring Tech Writer podcast. And thanks so much to each of you for listening to this episode.